policy is the tip of the spear for growth. And so where we have placed our policy leaders is to help be growth drivers for market expansion in Asia, market expansion in EMEA, LATAM, and beyond. And so the policy leaders are really critical business drivers as much as they are helping shape regulatory policy outcomes. They're also helping ensure we have a go-to-market strategy that is risk aware. And so I see this as a growth function first and a risk prevention function second.
Welcome to Policy Catalyst. I'm Caroline Malcolm, and after my own transition from a long career in the public sector into a fast-growing tech company, I wanted to dig deeper into what it means to be an effective policy practitioner, but outside of government. So in these conversations, we're going to be sitting down with some of industry's foremost leaders on policy to unpack how they think about the function, the unique ways it can support a company's goals, and how they measure success. So now let's dive into today's conversation. Dante, I'm delighted to welcome you to this episode. Thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure. It's great to be on with you.
Today you're in Washington, D.C., where you are the Chief Strategy Officer and Head of Global Policy for Circle. There's a lot I want to discuss about that, but maybe before we get there, what I really wanted to start with is to go way back in time, really before your professional kind of career path started off. And I'll just ask you, what was your first job?
Yeah. Oh my
And I'm
gosh.
talking back in school.
Oh, no, for sure. I'll give you my first job. My first job was equal parts entrepreneurial as it was intrapreneurial. I was in high school in Puerto Rico, and you may or may not recall, but Dunkin' Donuts used to have a partnership with Blockbuster Video. And so I became
things that survive to this day.
I work exactly a survival skill. I worked at a Dunkin' Donuts that had a walk-through window, and it was attached right next to a Blockbuster Video, so people would rent their videos and then come to the walk-through window and get their donuts handed to them late at night. And every night, the Dunkin' Donuts shop would throw away the donuts, and I'm like, well, there's an opportunity here, and so I would package them up, dust them off, and then sell them at school. So,
knowing you now, none of this is shocking to me. Did your bosses know what you were doing though?
No, they totally did. They totally did. It's the reminder that one person's trash is another person's breakfast donut.
Yes.
And I did that. That was my first job.
Wow. Okay. Well, we've come a little way from then, although perhaps there are some lessons about, whether you ask for forgiveness or for permission, but we can get to that a little bit maybe. Unlike many of the people that you actually meet in the policy space who kind of have this sort of fairly well-trodden path to policy roles in the private sector, yours is not quite that traditional path. Could you take us back to, where you started your professional life and how we got to where we are today?
Yeah. Well, I mean, one, I always wanted to be a diplomat, right? So when I became a little bit older and I spoke several languages growing up as a kid, diplomacy for me was always an attractive field, whether it was with the United Nations. I did Model UN in college, for example.
Yeah.
But then I realized that in time, the professional world and the business world also had a pathway, and you could frame yourself as a business statesman. So my original career, my professional career really begins in the insurance markets. And I used to run a large insurance company with customers all over the world dealing with very, very complex new risks. And then I started my own company. And the benefit of having started my own company, a company called Risk Cooperative, is that I didn't have to look over my shoulder to get cues from the media or the communications team about talking to the world, writing articles or books. And then I became more heavily involved with the think tanks. And one in particular called the American Security Project, which was started by John Kerry and Chuck Hagel, the Secretaries of State and Defense, respectively, is that I realized that there was an alternative way, that you didn't have to go into government to become a diplomat or a public servant, and you could very well stay in business, but at the same time live at that nexus of public and private objectives. And so Kerry and Hagel were modeled as business statesmen, and I'm like, maybe I could emulate that path.
What was it, do you think, about the sort of diplomatic world that was attractive to you? Was it the international aspect? Was it sort of the government to government aspect?
Yeah, I mean, part of it was being a risk and resilience person and really fundamentally caring a lot about the actual state of the world. And there's so many parts of the way we're addressing big complex risk, whether it's cyber risk or pandemic threats or climate risk and beyond, really do require whole of society approaches. And marshaling those approaches, you simply, the government balance sheet, for example, alone wouldn't be able to arrest the rising tide of cyber dependency or the perennial threat of pandemics, as an example. The more you could be a business statesman, the more you could make the case in a completely nonpartisan, tangible based way that big events required big ideas and big responses. And so that's part of what I found incredibly attractive of being in the orbit of think tanks like the American Security Project and others. The other piece of the puzzle is ideas don't get stuck in customs. Right. And so back in 2015, I conjured up the idea of writing a book now published titled Global Risk Agility and Decision Making. The byline was all about how do we survive the era of man-made risk, and the ability to put that out there as a thought piece that wouldn't get stuck in customs and in which the idea alone could drive a lot of convening power and a lot of important conversations was also incredibly gratifying about, the role of a business statesman. And then the last one is being a deep, deep believer in serendipity, right? What I realized that
Yeah.
the first article meant nothing, but the 500th article showed that there was a body of work and that the good ideas would actually, convey. And that opened up an enormous amount of serendipity and further opportunities to engage public conversations, private discussions, and meetings all over the world. And then fatefully, it was that very sum of work that got me invited to a secret briefing about a secret project that had not yet been launched, aka Libra, the Facebook-backed stablecoin effort. And that's how I somehow,
Presumably, this was the shift, right, from insurance to digital
yeah,
assets.
indeed.
Okay. Okay. So you arrive at, what was originally known as Libra, but today we're at Circle. Can you just take us along that little path to how that happened?
Yeah. Well, one serendipity being one piece of the puzzle. I was doing work with the New America Foundation and a particular group there called the Blockchain Trust Accelerator, in what by today's standard would be grainy vintage footage of conversations about the critical vulnerabilities we have in financial infrastructure and the fact that so much of the world's financial systems labor under single points of failure and cyber exposure and all kinds of other complex issues. And so I found myself invited to a briefing about a soon to be announced project where Facebook and 28 other organizations, and the rest is history, as we all know very well, we're going to launch this global payment system. And two things are vindicated with the benefit of hindsight. Number one, the regulatory response in some ways vindicates that when it comes to money, the central banks are an unmovable object. And just because you can do something with technology doesn't mean you should. On the other hand, obviously the experience of coming to Circle and the emergence of stablecoins, digital cash that don't take bank holidays, that are available universally on internet connected devices, we've obviously vindicated the broader vision commercially, but we've done so in a manner that respects the boundaries of trust, the boundaries of regulation, and the boundaries of competition policy. And so in some ways, Libra was a PhD in public policy. And it was also a front row seat into the very, very deep conversation around the future of money, the emergence of central bank digital currencies, the emergence of regulatory responses like the markets and crypto assets framework. I had a choice to make, right? I could either continue writing about these technology developments or I could become a protagonist. And if ever you're given the shot to any listener, take becoming a protagonist over merely being a witness, and a lot of good things can come of that.
So I love that first tip. What's interesting though is I think you've actually continued to be very prolific like in your writings about this space, and we might get to that because I think that's not something that sort of everyone sort of might look at and be like, well, how do you manage that with your sort of day job? And maybe like before we get too deep into Circle specifically, Chief Strategy Officer, Head of Global Policy. I mean, I'd love to talk a little bit in a moment about how those two things kind of, are they the one and the same thing? How do you think of them separately, the strategy and the policy side? But maybe just to give people a bit of a sense, I was going to say, like, can you tell us like a day in the life? But maybe that's just too ambitious. And let's maybe go for like a week. What does a week look like for you? Because I think a lot of people see your public facing stuff, but maybe know less about what you're doing when you're not talking to camera?
Yeah. Well, for one, I had the fortune at the Libra project. I led policy globally, right? And that was obvious in hindsight what I was doing because I was getting beaten up, and I operated as the human shield, if you will, for not just the project, but effectively explaining all of crypto, while at the same time serving as an unappointed ambassador defending Switzerland's reputation as a potential jurisdiction for a project of this scale. When I joined Circle, Jeremy Allaire, our founder and CEO, effectively hired me as the first person to occupy that role. And so I had this really distinct professional advantage of not only joining a company that had respected the pre-existing rules over moving money around the world, but had a franchise and a platform that was clearly on the up and up for a lot of good historical reasons and technological and other reasons. But when I joined, being person number one in this role, I had a chance to look at a clean sheet of paper and say, well, if you're going to do global policy really, really well, what are the levers that you also need to have in your hands in order to drive business outcomes? And so I ended up leading corporate communications, regulatory policy and strategy, social impact, and sort of being able to demonstrably move the needle on stubborn financial inclusion objectives around the world. We formed a chief economist office, and now today we add on to that international operations and sort of the governance of all of the international entities in the company. So it's a larger remit than a traditional policy leader might have. But frankly, for a company like ours, I think my highest level objective and that of the team is to ensure that the external market and regulatory environment is conducive to the best things that we could do with our technology and services. And that has meant helping create rules, helping ensure those rules are harmonized and passportable, and then, of course, ensuring that everyone everywhere doesn't get penalized for having access to digital currencies like USDC, on their mobile-enabled wallets. And so it's been an incredible journey, and in some respects, the fight continues from Libra to today. But in many respects, we could look backwards and say we're vindicated as a company, as an industry, and as a technology that we can make profound good and also enhance the competitiveness of the countries in which we're direct investors.
What is that sort of, and that's like a fantastic snapshot of kind of what the sort of objective of the policy function is. And I think, as you say, very interesting because people do conceive of that quite differently. And it may be a little bit unique to Circle in that regard, because you have a breadth in the role which allows you to kind of press those different levers. What does that actually look like day to day, though? Are you going to meetings with regulators? Are you writing pieces for major newspapers?
Yeah. Well, it's a lot. And one I've seen myself as a critical growth leader for the company. When I joined Circle almost 4 years ago now, we were a 120 odd person company. Today we're closer to 1,000. And so frankly, one of my very first tangible objectives was to ensure that the sun never set on the actual business. And that meant we would set a destination for having regulatory hubs and spokes in the major geographies around the world. And so our first destination was to get licensed in Singapore as a major payments institution. Later, we continued working with European stakeholders on the implementation of the markets and crypto assets framework. And there we made the choice of investing in Paris, France, as our regulatory hub for all of Europe. And then obviously here in the United States, helping the US as a country navigate its domestic fintech constitutional crisis has been, a main of my work. And frankly, that the team that I have recruited are also working on all the time. And so that alone would be enough. But a big part of my actual day and week is dealing with the team. We have an extraordinary team. I like to call them the Avengers. Every one of them is a superhero in their own right, but when you put them together, they're indomitable. So working with the team around the world, we have a very global group of leaders covering communication, regulatory strategy, impact, international operations, and other areas are all a part of this combined function. But a lot of my day is also dealing with the media, with policymakers, regulators, central bank, law enforcement, you name it. We run a business of no surprises, and we run a business of walking through the front door. Just as a tangible example, last year we probably wrote more than 400 pages of unique policy responses and consultations. No chat GPT. This is pen to paper.
I'm going to get to AI, but yeah.
you know, pen to paper, human intellect reflecting the Circle way of doing business as an export product around the world.
That you think would surprise people? And maybe that's to do with sort of, you talk a lot about the regulators, but there's also sort of the political aspect of policy versus the sort of policymaker aspect. Is there anything that you think people would be surprised about that you get up to in your an average week
Yeah.
running the team?
Well, you kind of hinted at a little bit of it, right? Which is that in an area of technology competition as novel as this one,
Mm.
AI is probably the only technology domain that comes close. Policy is politics. It's not yet rule of law. And so a big percentage of our time is actually spent thinking through what is the long range political, economic security, and global security argument for why this type of innovation needs to be brought into the fold. And that requires, speaking with members of Congress, senators, governments around the world, political leaders around the world, and being, frankly, a trusted emissary, not just on behalf of a company, but in some respects, I've often felt like I was the unappointed US ambassador for digital assets or fintech around the world, because at the federal level, there isn't yet in the United States a framework for what we do at the whole of government level. We're regulated at the state level and we're responsive to federal norms. And so that has given me this sort of unofficial ambassador status to speaking with the Bank for International Settlements, all the way down to meeting with central bank governors from different countries around the world. And in all cases, they want to know, what is the US going to do? What is the puff of white smoke going to be from the American crypto conclave? And it's been sort of an unofficial job of mine to help interpret what direction of travel the US is likely to take, because of the unique feature that this is ultimately in the hands of Congress, not in any particular branch of government or agency. And so that has been a pretty distinctive but pretty persistent unofficial role for the last 5 or 6 years, is to be a policy whisperer.
Mm.
The other thing I would say is, good policy for an industry like ours is not going to be shaped on crypto Twitter with name calling and invective. And so my second piece of unsolicited advice to policy leaders is money talks, wealth whispers, and power is silent. And so the fewer things you have to say, probably the better. And it probably means you have access to more of the authority and decision-making power around the world.
Yeah, I think that's something which can be very, very confusing. And I think there is a particular aspect that's about the sector that you and I sort of met over, sort of the crypto digital asset sector. It's very, very noisy in the public sphere. That's not true of all industries, of course, but it can be very confusing, I think, for people to be like, oh, well, these are the main issues of the day, because they hear so much about them in the public forum, but actually, it's actually not what policymakers or decision makers actually think about. And most importantly, I think amongst what you've said there is that, like, staying focused in the policy function on the business. At the end of the day, you can have all the sort of thought leadership and great arguments that you like, but if those, aren't aligned with the business and aren't helping move the kind of commercial side forward, and that's really kind of one of the biggest distinctions, I would say, and perhaps something people can be confused about when they're making that sort of public-private sector shift, is to really understand, you are part of a commercial enterprise at the end of
Exactly.
the day.
Exactly. And candidly, that's been, if you ask me, the internal piece of my job is to the degrees to which our major customers, investors, counterparties really care a lot about policy assurances as a part of their decisions to work with Circle, work with USDC, embed these products and services in their business model, is at the end of the day, they all want to know that what they are doing is either on the existing rules right side of history, or will be on the right side of history when all the global rules are set and harmonized. And that internal capacity to partner with the business team, the product team, marketing, and other cross-functional parts of the organization is a real way we ensure that policy isn't just this domain for an isolated part of the organization, but rather deeply embedded in the way we do business everywhere, and that it shows up commercially as a part of the growth function of the company as well.
So you touched a little bit. I do want to ask you a little bit about the internal stakeholders that you work with, but maybe before we get there, could you tell us a little bit about how the function is organized? You've got people regionally, perhaps some thematic organization. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah. So in terms of the policy team, we have regional organization where we have really world-class leaders in EMEA and APAC, covering LATAM and covering North America. Each of them as leaders is, I've tried, the smartest person in the room is the person surrounding themselves with people smarter than them. And so, I think the folks that have done really well in this team have self-selected at one level, that they see themselves aligning to the company's mission. They believe in what we're doing as a business, because otherwise the difficulty of navigating so much policy uncertainty is not for the faint of heart. And so the greatest leaders we've recruited have self-selected. But then the key, though, is to not have them operate in isolation or in silos from one another, but rather to ensure that any of the international colleagues are really ambassadors representing not just what's going on in their regions, but also being able to import in near real time the developments for Circle in its core markets or in the United States. And that sort of ambassador role, I think, is a really good feature. The next aspiration was to ensure that any one of them, would be recognizable in their own right, and not have to have the quote policy principle, me, Jeremy, or others kind of show up all the time, but to really ensure that they were endowed with these ambassadorial powers, but also externally thought leaders, public speakers, media ready, could write in their own voice and in their own pen about the issues shaping their regions and markets. And that's another critical development opportunity for policy leaders is, the power of the pen and the power of persuasion, especially in these novel domains, is your best friend. And oftentimes our policy publications may garner as much or more eyeballs and attention than marketing spend. And an example of that is 3 years now running, we've produced this USDC economy report designed as our opening act of every calendar year to tell the counter narrative of what regulated stablecoins that we are offering are doing for the world, and ensure that that was put in the hands physically of the major global stakeholders that we care about externally. And so that's a policy production, not a marketing production at Circle.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I think, something I'll double click on something you said there, which is that between the personal brand, and that might be of the people in your team or yourself, and the company brand, how do you think about those two different elements?
Yeah, well, first, I kind of categorically reject the notion or the idea of personal branding. I think the way I would describe it is authenticity. And that just as you could see through inauthentic brands and fake brands, I think people can easily determine, we have good enough filters as a species to easily determine when someone is being inauthentic. And I think that has been incredibly powerful. And Jeremy and myself and others, we've tried to aspire to the standard of personhood, called to testify. Even if it's going to be a very contentious hearing, we will show up and we'll get beat up in public because it's about personhood. I also think regulators and policymakers are less likely to want to blow up a company when they see that its principles are sincere and authentic, but not just principles as in people, but the principles in which it is governed. And so that for me has been really incredibly, one, beneficial, and two, it has in some respects built an insurance and an assurance policy for Circle. In being able to have person-to-person connectivity with a range of global stakeholders, domestic and global, has been a really, one, incredibly gratifying way of building a team and building a business at the same time, is building those permanent human-to-human connections with external stakeholders. We often tend to vilify policymakers and regulators, but they too have day jobs and aspirations and lives, and they're people first before they're policymakers. And that to me has been really one of the more gratifying parts of this journey.
It sort of suggests too, though, that to do this role well, you really need to be working in companies where you're very aligned with the mission, because otherwise you might find yourself not being able to have that authenticity, or you need to be able to find the angles that you're comfortable with to be able to kind of have that authentic voice. Is that fair?
No, 100%. And so while every large organization of substance, and certainly all of the ones competing in novel areas, novel technologies, need policy leadership and policy functions, not all policy people will go take any job. So I do not see myself as a policy mercenary in which I would go help fix any company's global policy problems or regulatory or reputational problems, because some of them are irredeemable. And you don't need my help. You need you need maybe a higher power help. But you're absolutely right, and that gets back to this notion of authenticity, because in some cases, personhood doesn't actually convey to companies. right? So policy leaders tend to be invited. Our chief economist is a great example. He's invited to sessions with his peer group that Circle couldn't get into. But because of his credibility, his intellect, and his stature, he is invited into a room that even the company may not be able to join because of the unique circles that he runs in. And that's been similar for our impact leadership. It's been similar for our regional policy leads. Is I want them to feel like they're endowed at the personal and the institutional level with utmost trust to represent the company and their own interests, and nary the twain shall meet. But the only way you're really going to do that well is if you believe in what you are doing when you get out of bed in the morning, and if you believe in the enterprise that you're working with or for. And so, I joke that no one works for me, they work with me. And I think this has been true of the type of team we've managed to recruit, and the way we've shown up in the world is, people can stand on their own 2 feet.
Yeah. Yeah. The regional differentiation piece, you have this sort of regional organization. Do you think of the policy function as differing across those different regions? Or do you think of there's different weights to different elements of the role? Or do you feel like it's fairly consistent regardless of where in the world you are?
Yeah. I mean, one, we would hope that it's incredibly consistent wherever in the world we are, and that in many cases, there's just a ravenous appetite from policymakers to learn from a company like ours. And so what we want to do is ensure that we could facilitate that engagement, be it one-to-many engagements or small circle, confidential engagements. That's why
Pun not
we
intended. Yeah.
yeah, pun intended. That's part of the reason why we have ensured, regional leaders really genuinely cover their regions. My
Mm.
my standard for them is if the word circle is misused in a high school geometry class, I want them to hear it and I want them to be able to respond. That doesn't mean we take this company under siege posture. I've been in organizations where they feel like they're under siege
Mm.
and everything in the policy organization is about defense and reputation risk. We're actually a company not under siege. We're a company under deep global engagement and high demand. And so we want to ensure high quality engagement. It also, of course, stands to reason that policy is the tip of the spear for growth. And so where we have placed our policy leaders is to help be growth drivers for market expansion in Asia, market expansion in EMEA, LATAM, and beyond. And so the policy leaders are really critical business drivers as much as they are helping shape regulatory policy outcomes. They're also helping ensure we have a go-to-market strategy that is risk aware and that sort of frames the way Circle partners with commercial entities and others. And so I see this as a growth function first and a risk prevention function second. And that's been fun. And that's why when I had a choice to fight for the title structure, I chose Chief Strategy Officer and Head of Global Policy as opposed to Chief Policy Officer, because I think of this as strictly a global growth function for this company, and the proof is in the pudding.
No, I love that, because I think one of the questions often is, well, we want to get into this region. Who goes first? Is it go to market? Is it policy? How, or is it marketing? How does that work? And it sounds like you see a strong role for kind of policy being out there as kind of the first, or at least some of the first boots on the ground.
Totally. No, 100%. In fact, if you think of it this way, what we do is first and foremost money, then you really have to respect the boundaries of how money is governed, the rules and the norms around the movement of money on a global basis, and the fact that you're genuinely into complete new terrain of device-centric money. And so in order to ensure we do not revisit the sins of the Libra project and then end up in this death spiral of asking for permission and forgiveness and this perpetual battle with external stakeholders, it's really important that you have like a tip of the spear policy function that can translate signal and noise, that can translate business intelligence in real time, and that you have a business. And that's been my partnership with Jeremy Allaire, our CEO, that you have a business that can ingest that signal and turn that into business decision making. And so anticipating MiCA, that's years of planning to be the first company to be regulated under MiCA, anticipating the necessity of a Singaporean platform for Circle to grow across APAC is years of planning to then have this advantage of being the regulated digital dollar in Asia. Same with Latin America, and anticipating a go-to-market strategy that would build a value chain with major partners like Nubank and BTG Pactual in Brazil, rather than figuring out how to circumvent the rules in these regions. That's policy informing corporate strategy and go-to-market, as much as it is, of course, our product and business and marketing functions, thinking strategically and globally about which regions of the world benefit the most and have the highest demand for our offering.
So that ingestion process that you just talked about, I'm gonna go back to this question of internal stakeholders. Who are you working with? What does that look like? Is that a very structured process? Is that a very top-down process? Does it happen sort of across from within your team to other teams, or is it really kind of you and your counterparts in the
Yeah.
organization?
So, first we have I think one of the critical stakeholders obviously is the corporate board. Unlike, frankly, a lot of still private crypto companies where board governance may be an afterthought, we have had a world-class corporate board forever as a firm. And with that comes a certain set of just broad governance accountabilities that also help inform a policy objective and strategy as much as a policy team can inform the board. We also have an exceptional officers team for which, the policy conversation helps drive the way we show up in the entire world, from corporate social responsibility objectives all the way down to competitive strategy. The business broadly and the executive leadership team of the company broadly ingests and is responsive to external policy realities. But then, the natural partners are obviously legal and compliance as well, because it's not enough to just write 400 or 500 policy consultations in a year, pages worth of consultations. We actually want to shape law. The reason stablecoins like USDC have grown, because increasingly people can see this bright line of legal and regulatory clarity. And so critical stakeholders here, our compliance function and our legal functions, are really a part of that combined apparatus of shaping regulatory policy and strategy. And then, so all this to say, deeply cross-functional. The line leaders are also very, very deeply cross-functional with their business and product colleagues at a regional level to ensure, again, that everything we do regionally is informed by global realities as much as developments on the ground.
Is that, in a sort of a very pragmatic sense, is that you're giving updates to the board, you're developing internal papers? What does that actually look like?
Yeah. I mean, one, we're prolific, right? Broadly as a
You
team and
definitely are.
individually. Yeah, individually, so begging the question, who's doing the writing? But a lot of it is actually we are a well-read company, right? Policy memos are written and read, and there's a narrative art to writing things in a compelling way so that people want to read it. And also getting down to what is the business implication is also, I think, a critical demand of the type of policy content that we produce internally. Then we're also, so that type of content gets widely syndicated. It informs country investment strategy, product roadmaps, global growth strategies. A big part of it, of course, is navigating uncertainty. Right? Borrowing from my years in the risk world, you could measure risk, but uncertainty creates panics and paralysis. And so we're also competing in a domain in which if the US economy sneezes, we catch a cold. And so caring deeply as a company and as a team around reputational risk management, navigating uncertainty is a big, big feature of the policy work that we do. And so therein lies as well a lot of what you see externally from us, not just the consultations, but speaking at conferences and writing op-eds and articles and showing up in the news frequently is also part of just explaining on the very front end of the conversation what we do and how we are situated vis-a-vis our peers.
When you think about like what it takes to do that sort of work, I guess there's a couple of things that strike me, both about your own background, but also knowing some of your team. You've got a mixture of people who've worked in government, haven't worked in government, and varying degrees of, say, technical expertise on the technology itself versus, say, the policy front. How do you think about those things and how necessary they are to being a successful policy person?
Yeah, look, I think experience in government is not a necessity per se, but it can be helpful. But of course, that's where the point I had raised at the beginning, people who self-select, whether they come from government or private sector, are often the very best people to recruit because they've already made the determination that they see themselves here. But, government experience and appreciation of those often invisible hands, but all powerful hands of government and policymakers, and having some respect for the boundary adds a lot of value. What I'm most looking for, however, is agency. This is not the type of company, nor is this the type of industry in which you could afford to wait around to have someone tell you what to do today. Not only because we're a remote first company, but because, everybody has agency in well-run organizations, and they don't need to be told what to do, and they don't necessarily need to understand what are the daily priorities, least of all in this function. So my joke for the team is that it's like our team's objective would be dealing with everything everywhere all at once. And in our industry, there is a decade crisis once a quarter. That banking or in traditional tech policy functions would not have the muscle memory of dealing with stress and duress and external crises and systemic risk at the same rate and speed in which we have had to deal with it at Circle. And so looking for agency and resilience in leaders. And then the last most critical function is this is a zero failure mission. What we are doing is category defining in some respects, but we also want to recruit not just in single teams, but in the business, people who believe in intense cross-functional collaboration and are working on the basis of this as a zero failure proposition. Those are high standards, but thus far, I count myself as incredibly fortunate to have managed to build a team that is delivering against those standards and doing so, I think, with exceptional results.
Okay, so there you touch on something I do want to dig into, which is this question of success and how do you measure it? Because some of the things we're talking about, I mean, these can be multi-year kind of projects, if objectives, if you can and think about it. But at the end of the day, you're running a business, you're running a team. How do you actually think about, okay, we're at performance review time. How do I know if I'm successful? How does the policy team as a whole know whether it's been successful? How do you measure that?
It's a very good question. And first of all, I would personally be really unsatisfied if we made the argument, which I suspect is a credible one, but that many policy teams might make, that, well, we're like the intelligence community. You only know when we fail, or you only know how important we are when we fail and there's a calamity.
Yeah.
I don't buy that. And nor do I
No,
think
neither do I. So I'm
nor
glad
do
to
I think
hear
my
it.
colleagues would withstand that. So we
Yeah.
have a pretty intense, objective-driven, key results-driven way of running the team and company. And so we link the policy activity and the policy functions to overall company objectives and critical results. And then we time bound them. Some of them are, date defined and substance defined. So, if there's a consultation due, have you done it? Have you done it by the right date? Did it include the right stakeholders? And is it of the right quality? That's how you produce 400 or 500 pages a year of global consultations and then not act surprised that the Circle way of doing business is increasingly becoming a global standard. It's in part because we could demonstrate the model works. And second, we could demonstrate that the sum of hundreds of these engagements around the world actually shape regulatory policy. But it is tedious, thankless, grinding work. And building an apparatus that can do that, irrespective of the expertise of individual policy leaders, but because of the sum of their parts, it takes machinery. Then, of course, I run corporate communications, international investment. And so, yes, many of those bodies of work are responsive to the crisis du jour, but you could be very measured in terms of media goals and objectives in terms of where you show up in the world and how the media receives your company. And then frankly, as the monetary historian Neil Ferguson says, money might be printed on paper or enshrined in metal, but it is trust inscribed. And the trust and the perhaps most unique value creating feature of our company is trust. And so that has direct impact on USDC circulation, commercial counterparties, the way we're regulated across the world, and the degrees to which we are a banked product is in no small measure a degree to which we could express the policy work as a part of the business decision-making and growth functions in the company. So very, very heavily measured and very, very, very focused on results in time-defined ways has been part of what's attracted the team and also what has ensured we are resourced correctly.
So, okay, yeah, I wasn't going to go there, but I will, given you've just said that, Dante, resources. How do you know when it's time to grow?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I've tried to create, this one is obviously somewhat personal, right? Because you want to create, there's a distinction between jobs and work. And I think so much of the world right now labors under creating work that doesn't necessarily.
And the work expands to fit the job available.
Well, or like building a road, the work is done when the road is built, or you build bridges to nowhere and then you have work, perennial work, but it isn't creating mobility and upward mobility. So I believe in creating jobs, right? And part of creating jobs is knowing that when you're hiring someone, it is for durable things to do and not just a flash in the pan and will not just be evaporated or eliminated given technology changes or competitive changes. And so we've been very careful and thoughtful, despite the fact that the business has experienced a lot of growth and hiring over the last 4 years, from 100 to 1,000 roughly. And a lot of that has gone into different functions, including the policy team and the broader team that I lead. But in all cases, when we have had trade-offs to make about do we insource the activity or do we outsource the activity, wherever it would protect and preserve a job, we would fire, quote unquote, an outsourced partner and keep the job. And that has created, I think, degrees of loyalty, hustle, accountability to the company and the team that would be a little bit uncommon if you just treated people like they were units of production as opposed to people with agency. So it's been, I think that's true of Circle, not just my team, but it's just been incredibly gratifying in such an uncertain industry with so many rapid failures all around us that we have built a company that is sort of a sea of an island of stability in a sea of uncertainty in crypto markets has really helped us recruit and retain exceptional people. But I think the core of it, the difference between job and work.
I know we're closing in on time, Dante. I do want to ask you back to those 400 pages and your comment earlier, which I might, about sort of generative AI. It wouldn't be 2025 in a conversation
Yeah.
about work if we didn't touch on it.
Hmm.
Many people see it as a productivity tool. You really emphasized earlier the need to, have that kind of human thought, personal thought, leadership behind it. So how are you using it, if at
Yeah.
all?
No. Well, first of all, we are a very, very, very heavily focused company on AI and its business transformation. Our CEO, our entire leadership team, myself included, have a pretty clear-eyed approach to this, which is that AI is not going to take your job. A company using AI effectively might take your job. And so we don't see this as a displacement tool for people. We see it as a tool that gives people exponential opportunities. And so we've created in our team, but across the company, AI ambassadors led by our chief of staff and led by key colleagues in each team on how to officially curate and roll out AIs across the whole company. In the policy function, there is a policy paper written once a day, every day in our industry or adjacent to our industry. And so this has given us an ability, for example, to ingest and filter, pan for gold, the most meaningful insights gleaned from these thousands of pages of external content that would be written every day. So that allows us to ingest much more and to stay in tune much more around what's happening in the broader policy conversation related to our industry. The other one, of course, is that we can now more rapidly analyze and digest and then create readouts of what the implications might be and how to summarize these policy developments in digestible ways. This allows us to conceive of keeping the team size constant while delivering more results across the company and across different stakeholders. So those are two obvious ways. And then I think the last one, of course, is, generating content. My own view is if a calculator well used can give you a math answer and the math answer is unequivocally yours, there is a space in which AI generated content, to the extent the curation process and the conversation that people might be having with AI allows them to really go places where the mind cannot on its own. We have to then figure out how to create a direct link of attribution to the curator of this content. So that's a novel domain. For my part, everything that I write myself, mostly because I love writing. And whether it's for an audience of one or an audience of many, I think good ideas put on paper are good ways to sharpen your senses. But broadly speaking, our company uses it effectively, and our team specifically has a number of use cases that we're piloting and prototyping with AI to help power our productivity.
Look, and I like the AI ambassador example, and I wouldn't be surprised to see other people kind of pick up on that model, and also this idea of being able. People, I think about it a lot as generation, but actually the ingesting and summary of, as you say, just a huge amount of content that comes out of this sector, and of many sectors every single day. It can be a way to kind of draw that down to kind of the most important elements. Do you see a massive transformation of AI by AI of the policy function go forward? Because you talked there about sort of being able to keep the team constant but increase output. But do you see it fundamentally changing?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I do think the analytical layer, the business intelligence layer, are two very obvious layers that need to be early adopters of AI and where they have the highest prospects of facing business risks if someone is doing this better than you. And so that for us is really critical. We also have broadly, we care a lot as a company around reputational risk and media management and communications. And so the ability to go well beyond the typical sentiment analysis and media analysis that you might get from today's generation of outside communications companies or media monitoring platforms. I think the intellectual and rapid deployment of AI in that category to have agents that are effectively stood up and set up to manage reputational risk and broad monitoring, I think is an open space that can have enormous business impact. But those 2 or 3 use cases that I just described do not necessarily spell out you're out of a job. What they spell out is you now have an opportunity to do your job better, and that you now have this sort of the difference between information and insights is insights are actionable. And if you deploy AI as a part of your broader company web of social listening, media listening, beyond, you have an opportunity to glean insights from that more so than you would if you get a 30-page report that just talks about broad sentiment. And so our communications team are doing a lot of work with AI as well to go beyond what would be the normal course monitoring of media mentions and communications in our type of company.
Yeah, no, and I think that communication side, it's always struck me that it's still very both manual, but also very focused on very traditional forms of media, which are not necessarily, where the kind of influence is being had. Dante, we are almost at time. Any last hot tip for people who might already be in policy, or they might be thinking about getting into policy, making that transition that you did? Anything you'd suggest that they experience or do or make sure they get exposure to?
Yeah, well, one, self-servingly, they need to listen to your podcast, because if today's conversation any guide, I do think being able to, really shine a light on where there's some really important common threads in the policy domain, and that a policy job well framed can also help people scratch the itch of public service in ways they didn't anticipate. And so if you do policy well, and in organizations you believe in, where you have a lot of authenticity in the broader company mission, it is the next best peer to public service if you're a part of a policy function that really wants to move the needle on big societal, economic, and other issues. And we've certainly found that here at Circle. So I would say subscribe to this podcast. And then candidly, we've also tried to ensure that our colleagues can build a portfolio life. So I want my colleagues plugged into think tanks. I want them, to the extent they can, serve on boards or other organizations that they're a part of, so that they don't end up becoming siloed. If there's anything true of technology and crypto especially, is that it is a echo chamber. And the worst ideas are the ones that are bouncing back to you that you yourself have said. And so be able to plug into think tanks and to organizations well beyond your boundaries, I think, is a really critical opportunity that policy leaders can exercise.
Dante, that's a beautiful note to end on. Thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciated the time.
Thank you, Caroline.